the CIA has been engaged in some brutal, you can say, ignoble acts, and that's putting it mildly, over the course of the time that they've been in power. And created. This goes into coups. This goes into creating strife with disinformation within the societies themselves, or putting in dictators into position that have been brutal with regards to those societies, particularly when we're talking about South America. But there's been no break. Well, South America and Asia. But there's been no break in the activities of the organization. Oftentimes we look at history and we act like history is something that happened back then and that the context somewhere has been broken, but there's been no strike or no stripping away of history. The organizations and the things that they done back then, meaning you read on it, it gives you some clue and context to the things that they're probably doing now. One of those things, even though we don't hear much about Afghanistan, we hear a lot about Syria. We are still in Afghanistan and Iraq. And while we may have military personnel that are there taking place in operations, the CIA is also operating, and they're operating on a parallel track to the military itself. The New York Times has exposed, and I have particular feelings about this for some reason, but they've exposed the CIA Afghanistan forces that have been terrorizing the local populations in Afghanistan. This is particularly in two various provinces. The New York Times makes the point that military personnel, meaning governmental military personnel, has been getting killed, or police forces killed in record numbers. But parallel to this, the CIA has been in operation, and they've been working with, or for that matter, you could say controlling, forces that were trained by the United States and essentially provided resources by the United States, 3 times as much as a regular Afghan soldier, with wider rule set, if you want to say there's a rule set at all. Meaning, while local institutions are bound by law, they are not. The CIA has been having these guys go on raids and terror campaigns in which they've been committing massacres and outright atrocities. The New York Times has been following up on this, meaning going to the sites in which these raids have taken place. And in many of these, they've been massacring civilians. Families where they would take brothers out and shoot the brothers or torture the brothers in front of the family. This stuff is rather grisly. The CIA supposedly handed over control over to the Afghan intelligence, but not so much. I mean, they still control it. They may control it through, let's say, not necessarily having agents, but in some cases, agents have been with them, but in many cases they are controlling these groups. These groups also speak in English, which creates more of a problem in the societies themselves because it associates the terrorizing with Americans, which you should at that point, because they've been governed and guided by Americans. Now, they made the argument in the paper that these groups were holding the line, but while simultaneously holding the line, they've also been terrorizing the populations, and the populations that have been terrorized have been going towards the Taliban. Meaning, in going about pursuing a war in this way, they are sending people to the enemies that they have gone to try to abolish or get rid of. Let me read part of the story. There's a fascinating dilemma, at least from their standpoint, that they run into. And it's a question I want to ask towards the end, but I want to give the story first, because if this gets into kind of a 420 stuff, I want to cut it. Alright, so let's do part of the story, and then I'm going to give my take on this and my issue with this. So let's start right here. Members of an Afghan strike force, they're going into explaining story. They always say you don't tell a story, you show it. The New York Times goes into a story in which a family gets essentially murdered. Let's see, within minutes, the raiders had separated the men from the women, and then the shooting start. They're driving away for questioning, bodies, a room up in flames. So the members of an Afghan strike force, trained and overseen by the CIA in parallel mission with the United States militaries, but with looser rules of engagement. the raiding party force had committed an atrocity, said Jamarl Zazi, member of the Kosh Provincial Council, who was part of the government's investigating team. Everyone we spoke to said that they swear on the innocence of the victims. Again, looser rules of engagement. We're trying to fight a war, we're trying to be big, we're trying to be bad, we're trying to fight a war. And in doing so, sometimes you crush eggs. I guess that would be the perspective. We think these people are guilty. We don't necessarily have to go through any kind of legal constraints. We can torture and terrorize them here to try to get the information that we need. If we screw up, our bad, and you move on. This is essentially what has been taking place. At a time when conventional Afghan military and police forces are being killed in record numbers across the country, the regional forces overseen by the CIA have managed to hold the line against the most brutal militant groups, including Haqqani wing of the Taliban and also the Islamic State loyalists. But the units have also operated unconstrained by battlefield rules designed to protect civilians, conducting night raids, torture, and killings with near impunity in covert operations that some Afghan and American officials say is undermining the work of the wider effort to strengthen Afghan institutions. You don't say! You don't say! You've created essentially a Batman, meaning you created a group that goes out and completely undermine and flouts the laws that were there to protect your civic rights. So this black ops group that completely ignore the civic rights of the people who are in that country itself, and you're shocked that the rules that are supposed to organize or allow the people themselves to kind of, I'm saying this poorly, but essentially your right to life, if you want to say that, and having the laws of that country assert that right to life and have institutions in order to protect that right to life, and you have a group that's been created that completely flouts that, and you're shocked those institutions that are supposed to be there to protect that and has been shown to be unable to protect that are somehow weaker and subverted by the experience. You're shocked by that. I don't know why you're shocked by that. Let's keep going. I'll go back to that part later, but many of the strike forces were officially put under the control of the Afghan intelligence starting in 2012, but senior Afghan and international officials say that the two most effective and ruthless forces in Khost and Nangarhar provinces are still sponsored mainly by the CIA. Those fighting forces, also referred to as counterterrorism pursuit teams, are recruited, trained, and equipped by the CIA agents or contractors who work closely with them out of their bases, according to several current and former senior Afghan security officials. And the members of the paid nearly 3 times as much as regular Afghan soldiers. For a month, the New York Times has investigated the human toll of the CIA-sponsored forces on communities. Times journalists researched frequent complaints, at times almost weekly, that these units had raided and killed civilians. The Times also went to sites that had dozens of their raids, often less than 24 hours after the forces had left. The investigation found details of the CIA mission with tactical successes that have come at the cost of alienating the Afghan population. One former senior Afghan official accused the strike forces of committing war crimes. Often the raids that resulted in civilian deaths were carried out not far from police outposts or government officials, leaving those American-supported officials humiliated in their villages that they had been trying to establish relationships with. That makes all the sense in the world. If your police force found itself unable to protect the rule of law, then what is the point of your police force? It undermines those institutions. If you, as an American, had a job in Afghanistan where you were trying to make contacts in those particular areas in order to forge better bonds and better communication with that group, and there's an American-led group that has committed an atrocity in your village, your ability to make any inroads has been completely neutered. In a jar. Gone for good. You're damaging and destroying the bonds that you're trying to create. You're creating your enemies. Batman creates his Joker. The dilemma is that, well, yeah, I'll get back to that. But first, let me go back to this part. The abuses are actively pushing people toward the Taliban, the officials said. And with only a relatively small number of American troops contingent left, and that perhaps set to drop further on President Trump's orders, the strike forces are creating an increasingly the way that large numbers of rural Afghans will experience the American presence. So, look, just to make a quick argument, at least I'm going to try to make the argument quick. Um, this stuff is somewhat random, right? Like, your awareness and everything else, for the most part, your identity is constructed around where you've come from. This idea that there is an individual you experience it as individuality, but ultimately, who you are is purely an environmental quirk of something. I mean, you didn't necessarily control where you were plopped in life. You didn't necessarily control the culture. You didn't control your race. You didn't control any of the factors that were around you. You didn't control even when in the time stream you were being plopped. Who you are, regardless of how individual you think you are, is some relationship between you and the society itself. This idea that there's an individual I in this. You are either pushing back against something the society gave you, you are either accepting something the society gave you, but either way, you're interacting with the society itself. This idea of an individual you making decisions, you experience it as I making a particular decision, but ultimately those things are governed by things that are not necessarily controlled by you. I say that to say this. In societies that are more intact, where people can get more access to their needs and have more structure in their life and everything else, that society maybe have less chaos. Let's say it that way. In which case, you have less large shifts in the political space in order to try to find a certain degree of balance. But in societies that have been broken, how do you put the Rubiks Cube back together? Who I am, for the most part, are a series of factors coming all the way from the time that I was born and even exceeding before the time I was born, because how I am is somewhat of an extension of my mom, who is somewhat of an extension of her mom, who's somewhat of an extension of her mom, going all the way back to certain lines. There are incremental changes, sometimes large swaths, agreed, but incremental changes between individuals that are involved, meaning there is no break in history. How I am is somewhat of a factor of how I was raised. What does it look like when you're raised in a war zone? And what does it look like when your country has been smashed to ribbons, smashed to bits? And what's considered, from our standpoint, to be a normal way of functioning is not necessarily the normal way of functioning, as people have to make accommodations when how they were raised or how they grew up wasn't necessarily the most intact. I'm saying that from the standpoint of a country like Afghanistan. Afghanistan wasn't always this way. And in not always being this way, this country, for the most part, has been set afire. How do the people who were raised and born in situations where these things were set afire, how do you put the Rubik's Cube back together? And can you put that Rubik's Cube back together when there is a terrorist force that is going through terrorizing civilians? I understand that the Taliban exists, but keep in mind, some of the people who are joining the Taliban are not doing so because they're religious maniacs. They're doing so because they're pushing back against what's considered an invasion in their particular country. I want to make this pretty plain. How do you put the Rubik's Cube back together? And is the way to do this essentially terrorizing the local population with deaths and killings and everything else, and having those deaths associated with an American influence in your country? Does that mean that the CIA in America just stay in this particular stasis forever? Or do you get somewhat of a more stable societal structure? And can you get a stable societal structure with an increase in black ops? Like, how do you create a stable government when you have a black ops operation? Part of the point of a stable government is protection of the population who's in that country. I mean, you're ceding a certain amount of your own authority in order to create a strengthened unit of protection and prosperous for the citizens themselves. And you have this black ops group that are going through killing and engaging in the deaths of civilians. If the government itself is not capable of dealing with the problem of the Taliban in a way that is overt and open, then what is the use of the government itself? I guess this is the question of Batman and Superman to some degree. How does Superman live in a world with Batman? And doesn't this somewhat undermine whatever is trying to take place above board? One of the officers makes this point expressly plain, and I gotta be honest, I was fascinated that he stated this way, because this is blisteringly honest. This is not necessarily the honesty that you usually hear in media, meaning I would never hear Chuck Todd make this argument because media has a certain perspective that they try to keep of the country to which they occupy. But two things. One, if you're killing the civilian population this way, that civilian population makes all the sense in the world from an incentive point to push back against what they consider to be an intrusion into their country. And if the fastest boat moving is the Taliban, then it may make all the sense in the world that they go towards the organized group that's fighting against the presence that's in the country. Especially if you are committing atrocities, and they can use those atrocities to essentially drum up support of saying, hey, fight back the invaders, whatever the mission and the objectives of the Taliban are. That's the first point. From a pragmatic viewpoint, that has to be understood when this particular process is taking place, meaning that the argument for the person who's pursuing this process, who they would probably consider, hey, this is the pragmatic approach, is that the number of people that they kill and murder is going to be greater or less than the number of people who are going to go towards the Taliban is going to be negligible, or at very least a manageable factor or an accepted factor in the pursuit of whatever objective they're trying to pursue. Meaning, we can scare the shit out of enough people to prevent them from going to the Taliban, and the number of people who we killed who's going into the Taliban is somewhat of a manageable factor. Meaning, this process, this way of going about this, is at the very least a stalemate, or to some degree we believe we can grind out a certain degree of attrition damage and taking it down. They may call it counterterrorism, but ultimately that's the argument that they're trying to make. The number of people that are going to go to this group is not going to be more than the number of people we can either kill or capture. We can decrease the numbers in the group, even though we're going to get a lot of people moving into the group. That's gross, but that's the argument. Is there a different argument? Do you even need to have that particular argument? Like, is there a way to go about putting the Rubiks Cube back together in a way that doesn't involve this particular process? And is it possible that the very process that we're talking about just creates a perpetuation of somewhat of a cycle of this behavior? Meaning, this is not a path to putting the Rubiks Cube back together because you're creating your monsters. Batman creates his Joker. The problem is this, and this is breathtaking honesty of somebody who's probably sitting in a room and who's given the job of a military capacity or some kind of oversight capacity in this area. The dilemma is this: CIA needs to fight its wars in the shadows, said Carl Eichenberry, a former commander of American forces in Afghanistan who later served as the United States ambassador to Kabul. But when the United States also takes on the mission of state building, then the contradictions become the two approaches. I love this. Stealth, black ops, and non-transparency versus institution building, rule of law, and accountability become extraordinarily difficult to resolve, and our standing as a nation suffers. It's not that it's extraordinarily difficult to resolve. There is no way to resolve that. I mean, like I said, the moment that you have somebody who's working in the shadows, that completely undermines any notion of the public itself vesting certain powers to the government with the idea that there's going to be any level of transparency. The CIA is the same way with this. The CIA operates in the shadows, and even when they pass a law that say that any let's say any order or command that's given to the CIA in order to do something shady around the globe, there needs to be some kind of tether to where that law came from or where that was passed, where the order was given. Still, that chain of command was broken. The CIA operated in the way the CIA thought it needed to operate it, under this thought that we're the good guys, and particularly in the Cold War mandate. In this case, we have a similar situation, but this time in Afghanistan. We're trying to build a nation. Great. We're trying to forge bonds and whatnot in order to build this nation because we're trying to build institutions in order to get this country to some degree of modernity. Great. We're also fighting a war. That's not great. And the institutions that we're building are not mature enough to fight that war. Yeah, that's a problem. So we've built Batman to go out and punch bad guys in the face. But doesn't that undermine the institutions that we're trying to build, particularly when you have stuff a rule of law, and people who are under those laws, part of those laws said that that person has the pursuit of life, or at the very least the right to life. He shouldn't be killed or whacked or murdered or tortured. That is also true. Then if you have a group that is going through doing those things, then that kind of flouts the rule of law, right? Yes. then how do you build the institutions when the institutions are being outright flouted? That's a dilemma. Those things are contradictions. Yeah, those are contradictions, all right? That's an understatement. I to make this slightly comic bookish, but I've asked this question before because this gets into, does Star Trek need Section 31? Does Batman need Superman? Fact of the matter is, in a world with Superman, there should be no Batman. Like, and under this guideline, let's say Superman is a government to some degree. They don't work in parallel. If something is wrong in your government that's creating a fomentation in the way it's creating a fomentation, then that needs to be accommodated. The government needs to be able to accommodate that. Societal structure needs to be able to accommodate that. Or you get into this question of, is sending out Batman in of itself this thing that Superman tolerates because Superman doesn't believe he can tolerate it. In this case, and that somewhat goes beyond the point, they're creating their monsters. They're creating their monsters. You can never resolve that issue going under the model to which they're going under. So, Batman is war propaganda. Batman is war propaganda. To some degree. I mean, look, I think it's a fascinating question, right? I mean, you have a situation, or let's say Star Trek, Section 31. Does Star Trek need Section 31? You have an ideal society, and in that ideal society, the assumption is made somewhere that the idealness of the society doesn't allow it to understand or accommodate these anti-societal factors, in which case you need something that can go beyond the rules, because this anti-societal factors would use the fact that the society is a particular way to undermine that society. Look, I think of it this way. Societies that maybe not necessarily idealize, but societies that aren't, where people have access to the things that they need, I don't think they fall with this level of chaos. Like if you think of the societies around the world, like Switzerland, Denmark, those societies where they're more equitable and more even, they don't have this level of political chaos that we have. I root that in economic woes, so people not having access to the things that they need, and having that on somewhat of a mass scale, where people are in somewhat of a mosh pit, just trying to make ends meet, with 95% of the wealth going to the top 1%. I think when people are vulnerable and people need to make the ends meet, they do what they have to do to make the ends meet. This isn't necessarily a right or wrong thing. This is if people need to feed their kids, need to put roofs over their heads, they have things that society tells them that they should shoot for or go for, they have belief system, all these things. We're in somewhat of a mosh pit. But I guess the point is, if you've allowed your society to decay to such a degree where you have that level of political turmoil, then the question becomes, how do you put it back together? And do you need emergency assistance to put it back together while at the same token trying to find a way to get back to some level of idealness? The answer to that question becomes somewhat difficult. I mean, your government needs to take certain actions, and you can make an argument that allowing these black ops groups to operate in and of itself is the government taking an action, even though the government doesn't want to acknowledge that it's taking that action. This idea of a shadow self. This is somewhat problematic to me. I don't think you can have it both ways. Nico P. These belief systems were created under the banner of propaganda and make it so hard that it's the only way of keep people stable in their creature comforts. So the thing is, I think what happens is, it's like beating your dog versus training your dog. Like, it is easy to hit your dog in this kind of immediate thing of trying to get something accomplished, while simultaneously the better way to do it is to train your dog, but it takes more time. Like, it's almost, you can say the black ops group is for political expedience, as opposed to, they have some political aim, they want to stop this particular group, missing the point that their intrusion into society was the thing that created this group, or gave that group a certain degree of energy in and of itself. We shouldn't be there, man. We shouldn't be there. Like, all of this, to some degree, is because we shouldn't be there. All of these questions that are being posed just by our interactions in this particular situation is because we should not be there. We shouldn't be there. Our society is impoverished by design. That is, yes, I agree with that. We are a rogue nation. That is true. Jelly Donut, lead by example, something the U.S. hasn't almost ever done. We're a nation, and like any other nation, we pursue our own objectives or the things that are in our own objectives. The problem here, I think, that we get is the propaganda. This freedom, justice, American way, this Superman icon, all this other stuff. That's some degree of propaganda. The United States, like any other nation, goes in a direction of its own pursuits. Just saying. Robert Puke Ray, if we need a black ops, do we need a deep state? Are deep states tied to shadow school? This is kind of what I'm getting at. Like, I'm not saying that answer is yes. I don't. The answer presupposes something about reality. Like, we shouldn't be there. The fact that we're there is the thing that's creating the question. But the first complication is we shouldn't be there. Like, the fact that the question exists at all is creating somewhat of a problem. The question shouldn't exist because we shouldn't be there. When you get to that second point of asking the question, then you're in your outcomes have been constrained. And again, you still end up with, what do I want to accomplish while I'm here? And is this the best way to accomplish this? And if this is the way to accomplish this, should we be here in the first place? It's not that they fail to realize that their actions create chaos. The intent is, in fact, to create chaos. Yes, it makes looting and extracting resources easier. That I agree with. See, I don't agree that oftentimes when media talks about this stuff, they talk about this stuff from the perspective that there's not bad faith. Like, the people are interacting and engaging in ways where everyone has good intentions. I don't accept that everyone has good intentions. Like, the goal of it is not necessarily to create a stable government. We destroyed Libya, and there's always this excuse of humanitarian excuse, missing the point that they're creating humanitarian catastrophes. So yeah, I agree, Shigar. And a link, you 3 videos that you really like. I will check that out, Mark. We have to protect American interests. That's more true. That's more true. That's more true than anything else. Noam Chomsky makes that point extraordinarily clear. All right, my stream is going in and out, so I'm going to end this one. But I saw this. One of my subscribers sent me this, and I wanted to show it. I got to be honest, I don't remember his name, so forgive me that I don't remember his name, but thank you for the article. It's a good one. Thanks all.